if you pick up the Quran looking for the story of creation, you won't find a neatly packaged book of Genesis.
Right. Doesn't work like that.
Yeah, you'll find a piece of the story in chapter 2, and then you'll find another fragment in chapter 7, another in chapter 15, and still more in chapter 17 and 18.
It's very spread out.
Exactly. The entire text is built like a massive scattered jigsaw puzzle. And today, we are looking at a really fascinating academic paper that argues this exact fractured structure is what makes the book so incredibly easy to weaponize.
I mean, it is a structural reality that completely changes the demands placed on the reader.
How do you mean?
Well, when a historical narrative or a legal code isn't presented chronologically or even thematically, the methodology you use to read it becomes like the single most important factor.
Right. It dictates what you walk away believing the text actually says.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring a comprehensive paper titled The Qur'anic Reading and Its Method. It's written by Louay Safi, a professor of politics and Islamic thought.
Yeah, and it's quite a paper.
It really is. We are unpacking the intricate art of reading and interpreting one of the most widely read and honestly intensely debated texts in human history.
And because any discussion analyzing the interpretation of this specific text inevitably brushes up against some pretty intense religious convictions and polarized political critiques.
We really need to be clear with you, the listener, right up front.
Absolutely. Our goal today is not to take a theological or political side. We are not endorsing any specific religious viewpoint or political faction mentioned in the material.
Right. We are purely analyzing the academic, historical methodologies that Professor Safi presents. We're just looking at the mechanics of how a text is read.
Yeah, we're looking under the hood at the engine of interpretation, so to speak.
Okay, let's unpack this. Safi's core thesis is that the meaning you derive from the Qur'an depends fundamentally on the framework the reader brings to it.
Right. So if you approach a complex text with a flawed method, you are practically guaranteed to extract a distorted meaning.
So let's go back to that scattered structure. If I have a jigsaw puzzle and I only look at the blue pieces, I can confidently declare that the entire picture is just a blue sky.
And you'd be completely missing the mountains and the trees.
Exactly. I'm ignoring the rest of the board. But I mean, doesn't building a text this way practically invite people to misinterpret it?
Oh, it creates a massive vulnerability. And Safi argues that this fragmented structure absolutely makes the text susceptible to what he calls selective reading.
Okay. And he doesn't view selective reading as just a casual academic mistake, does he?
No, not at all. He actually frames it as an act of deception.
Wow. Deception.
Yeah. When a reader cherry-picks isolated verses, they are subordinating a divine text to their own personal desires or, their political goals.
So instead of allowing the text to guide them, they turn it into a tool to advance their own self-interest.
Precisely. They force the text to validate the conclusion they already arrived at before they even open the book.
Man, that's heavy.
It is. And that leads to one of the most profound observations in Safi's paper. It's almost a horseshoe theory of textual literalism.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, he points out that extreme Muslim literalists, those who might seek to justify hostility toward people of other faiths and prolific Western critics of Islam, actually use the exact same flawed methodology.
Wait, really? So the extreme critics and the extreme literalists are essentially looking in the mirror when it comes to how they process information.
They're methodological twins. Safi uses the example of Robert Spencer, a well-known Western critic of Islam.
Okay.
Spencer argues that violence is inherently rooted in the Qur'an by cherry-picking isolated verses about fighting, completely stripping them of their textual and historical context.
Ah, the blue puzzle pieces again.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Muslim literalists do the exact same thing with the exact same verses to justify their own hostilities.
While both groups completely ignore the hundreds of other verses that preach restraint, peace, and respect for religious diversity.
Right. They are both just gathering the blue puzzle pieces and ignoring everything else.
But if cherry-picking is a known danger, how did early scholars approach a text that was delivered to a very specific tribal society 1,400 years ago, yet is claimed to be eternal?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because if it is purely eternal, how do you avoid just rigidly replicating 7th century Arabian society today?
Well, that tension sparked one of the most profound intellectual battles in the Third Islamic century. You had a rationalist theological school called the Mu'tazila.
Okay, the Mu'tazila.
Right. They argued that the Qur'an was created in time, meaning God generated these words historically to address specific 7th century events and communities.
So because it was an event in history, they believed human reason had to take the lead in figuring out how to adapt its underlying justice to new, completely different eras.
Yes, they viewed the physical text itself as bound by time.
Interesting.
They did. But the broader scholarly community, who later became known as the people of the Sunnah, fundamentally rejected that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they argued the Quran is the uncreated eternal speech of God. It transcends history entirely.
But wait, if the text is entirely eternal and transcends history, wouldn't that practically demand strict literalism?
That's the challenge.
I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture, how do we apply ancient guidance to our modern lives right now? How do you apply an ancient mandate about a caravan dispute or a tribal alliance to a modern, interconnected global society without running into absurdities?
That is the exact philosophical trap early exegetists had to navigate. To solve it, they developed a vital analytical tool known as Asbab al-Nuzul, which translates to the reasons of revelation.
The reasons of revelation, okay.
Right. They realized that to avoid dangerous literalism, you must understand exactly why a specific verse was revealed in the first place. You have to understand the historical trigger.
But if the text condemns a specific tribe, how do you mathematically prove that it's just about 7th century politics and not a permanent divine decree? How did early scholars draw that line?
By looking at the specific behavior the text was responding to. So Safi uses the example of verses that condemn specific Jewish tribes in Medina.
Okay, a modern literalist might read those verses and claim the text demands eternal hostility toward Judaism.
Exactly. But when scholars applied Asbab al-Nuzul, they looked at the historical context. Those specific tribes were actively violating peace alliances and conspiring with enemy armies against the newly founded Muslim community.
Ah, see.
So the condemnation was a response to unscrupulous political behavior and the breaking of treaties by specific individuals at a specific time.
So it was not a blanket condemnation of the Jewish faith.
Not at all. And we know this because other verses in the Quran urge respect for religious freedom and honor the traditions of Judaism.
What's fascinating here is how separating a universal value from a 7th century cultural practice entirely shifts the paradigm of the text.
It really does.
You abstract the universal principle, which is that breaking treaties and committing treason is wrong, from the concrete historical event.
You find the eternal truth embedded within the temporary historical situation.
But context only gets us so far, right? I mean, knowing why a rule applied to a 7th century treaty dispute doesn't automatically help a 10th century trader or a 21st century internet user.
True. Society evolves, economies shift, technologies change.
So how did early scholars bridge that gap and create rules for new situations without just, inventing laws out of thin air?
That required introducing human reason into the interpretive process. Muslim jurists realized they needed to apply rigorous intellectual effort to develop a normative system of law, the Sharia, that could regulate a rapidly expanding civilization.
And they called this intellectual exercise ijtihad.
Yes. And one of the foundational tools of ijtihad was qiyas, which is strict legal analogy.
The concept of qiyas is fascinating. Safi uses the example of wine in the paper.
He does. The Qur'an explicitly bans wine.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Early jurists banned all intoxicants, not just wine, because they identified the efficient reason, the ilah, which was intoxication.
Right. They had to figure out what to do with other intoxicants that weren't specifically mentioned.
It's like a parent banning a smartphone at the dinner table, and by extension, banning tablets and laptops, because the underlying rule isn't strictly about the brand of the device.
It's about removing digital distractions during family time.
Exactly.
And that exact logic, finding the underlying ilah, caused a massive defining split in early Islamic law.
Because the application of human reason was heavily contested.
Oh, heavily contested. You had strict scholars in the Second Islamic century, like Al-Shafi and Ibn Hanbal, who severely restricted ijtihad.
Why was that?
Al-Shafi was deeply concerned that if judges used too much personal reasoning, the law would become arbitrary. He wanted to standardize law to prevent rulings based on personal whim.
Ah, so he confined interpretation strictly to literal texts and very tight legal analogy, qiyas.
Exactly. And Ibn Hanbal went even further, insisting that even a weakly authenticated saying of the Prophet, a hadith, should be prioritized over human reasoning.
So they wanted to tether the law directly to historical practices, minimizing the human element as much as possible to preserve the purity of the text.
Right. But other major schools of thought, specifically the Hanafi and Maliki schools, argued that strict analogical reasoning could sometimes lead to terrible, unjust outcomes in the real world.
Okay, so they developed concepts like istihsan, which means juristic preference, and istisla, focusing on public interest.
Yes.
But how does juristic preference actually work in practice, though? If you have a strict legal analogy, how do you justify breaking it?
Well, think about it in terms of agricultural trade. Under strict legal analogy, a financial contract might require that you physically see the exact goods you are purchasing to prevent fraud.
Which makes perfect sense if you are buying a horse.
Right. But what about a farmer who needs to sell next season's wheat crop today just to get the cash to survive the winter?
The wheat doesn't physically exist yet.
Exactly.
So under strict analogy, that transaction is completely void. The farmer can't sell what he can't show.
And enforcing that strict analogy would ruin the farmer and damage the local economy.
Oh, wow.
So Hanafi jurists utilized istihsan. They bypassed the strict analogical rule because enforcing it would cause tangible harm.
They prioritize the public good, the economic survival of the community over the rigid mechanical application of a legal analogy.
Yes, they recognize that the ultimate goal of the law isn't just to be mathematically consistent. It is to serve human welfare.
Which brings us to the evolution of this methodology, what Safi calls the maqasidi approach, which was pioneered by the Andalusian jurist al-Shatibi.
Right, maqasid al-Sharia translates to the purposes of the law. Al-Shatibi fundamentally rejected the practice of reading textual statements in a vacuum, completely divorced from their rationale.
Okay.
He argued that the entire legal framework exists to advance 5 supreme overarching purposes: the protection of religion, life, reason, property, and progeny.
You know, it sounds incredibly similar to the difference between a local city ordinance and a supreme constitution.
That's a great way to put it.
You can't pass a local parking law that violates the First Amendment. Shatibi is essentially arguing that these 5 purposes protecting life, reason, property, religion, and progeny serve as the constitution of the Qur'an.
Yes.
So any interpretation of a specific narrow verse that violates those 5 supreme purposes is automatically unconstitutional.
That is the perfect way to visualize the maqasidi framework. It is a hierarchical system where universal principles always overrule isolated, literal readings.
I really like that framework.
And Safi briefly outlines 5 modern principles derived from this. Things like looking at the totality of statements, prioritizing universal rules over particular ones, and ensuring Qur'anic statements override prophetic ones in cases of conflict.
Let's test this constitutional framework on the hardest possible topic.
Okay, let's do it.
Theory is great, but how does this method hold up against the most contentious topic of all? Earlier, we mentioned Robert Spencer and Muslim literalists cherry-picking verses about war. Spencer points specifically to chapter 9, verse 73. It says, "Strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be firm against them."
Yes.
And Spencer says, look, it's right there in black and white. It says strive hard, which means fight against unbelievers. How does the maqasidi approach deal with a verse that sounds so overtly aggressive on its face?
Well, Safi's method doesn't try to gloss over it. It subjects that verse to a rigorous set of investigative principles derived from al-Shatibi's work.
Okay, so where do we start?
The very first rule of the maqasidi approach is that you can never establish a ruling or a worldview based on a single isolated verse. You must gather the totality of the text.
So you cannot interpret chapter 9 without also reading chapter 2.
Exactly.
You put all the puzzle pieces on the table first.
That's right. Then you apply the second principle. You must reduce this multiplicity of rules into a coherent set of universal values. And a narrow, particular command can never override a broad, universal one.
Okay, makes sense.
When you look at the totality of verses regarding conflict, the universal principle found in chapter 2, verse 216, is that fighting is hateful, or an object of dislike.
It is not something to be desired for itself.
Correct.
But wait, how do those two coexist? You have a universal principle saying war is hateful, but chapter 9 says strive hard against them.
That requires the third and fourth principles of the framework. You must ensure the underlying reason is explicit, and you must tie the rule to its historical socio-political context.
Ah, the historical trigger again.
Yes. The command to fight in chapter 9 was not a blanket mandate regarding all people of different faiths. The striving was directed at specific pagan groups in 7th century Arabia who had repeatedly broken treaties, openly reviled the religion, and violently driven the Muslims from their homes.
Oh, so it's highly specific.
Very. And verse 2.190 clarifies the scope entirely, stating, "Fight in the way of God, those who fight you, but do not commit aggression, for God loves not aggressors.
So the context limits the scope. You cannot initiate war against peaceful parties.
Furthermore, verse 2.193 explicitly commands that if the enemy desists and stops fighting, you must stop hostility immediately.
So the historical context proves it was a specific defensive response to ongoing persecution, not a general law of religious intolerance.
Exactly.
But what if someone brings up a hadith, a recorded saying of the prophet from outside the Qur'an that seems to support the more aggressive literalist interpretation?
The framework handles that as well.
Okay.
The fifth and final principle is a strict conflict resolution mechanism. If a statement attributed to the prophet contradicts a universal precept established in the Qur'anic statement always takes priority.
Because the Qur'an is the supreme constitution.
Yes,
Yeah.
a historical hadith cannot override its overarching purposes.
And Safi pivots from dissecting these rules of war to look at the broader horizon. If the ultimate goal of the text isn't conflict, what is it?
He argues emphatically that the ultimate goal is peace.
Peace.
Peace is entirely foundational to the text. Safi highlights that peace as-salam is actually one of the beautiful names of God in the Qur'an mentioned in chapter 59.
The text constantly invites believers to what it calls the abode of peace.
Right.
He describes the human mission as a grand, evolving journey. You start by finding inner peace through moral discipline. You take that inner peace and use it to build communal peace and justice within your society. And ultimately, that all leads toward eternal peace.
Yes, the struggle the text outlines isn't about holy war. The struggle is the tedious, everyday, unglamorous challenge of choosing justice, compassion, and public welfare over greed, literalism, and oppression.
And that brings us right back to the methodology we started with. If you read the text selectively, driven by existing prejudices, anger, or desire for power, you will easily find verses you can strip of their context to justify violence.
You turn the divine text into a source of destructive energy.
But if your intention is to find wisdom, and you apply a holistic, systematic method that respects the historical context and the overarching purpose of protecting life and human dignity, you find a definitive message of harmony.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Let's zoom out and look at the core journey of our deep dive today. We started by exploring how the fragmented, non-chronological structure of the Qur'an makes it incredibly vulnerable to cherry-picking.
Right, the scattered jigsaw puzzle.
We saw how stripping away the asbab al-nuzul, the historical context, allows both literalists and critics to invent hostile narratives that ignore the totality of the text.
And we explored how early Muslim scholars combated this through the maqasidi approach. They utilize human reason and juristic preference to elevate universal values, ensuring that strict legal analogies never superseded the ultimate purposes of the law.
Purposes like protecting life, reason, and public welfare.
This raises an important question, though, regarding how our own internal intentions shape our understanding of literally anything we read.
Yeah, that's a huge point.
Safi quotes a profoundly self-aware verse from the Qur'an itself, chapter 3, verse 7. It warns that those with perversity in their hearts will always seek out the ambiguous, isolated verses to cause discord and twist the meaning to fit their agenda. But those who are grounded in knowledge, those actually seeking wisdom, will look at the whole book to find its true foundation.
It suggests that a text doesn't merely speak to us, it reveals us.
Yes.
The meaning we ultimately extract is very often a reflection of the methodological baggage and the personal intentions we brought to the table in the first place.
That's beautifully said.
Which leaves you with a final provocative thought to mull over today. If Louay Safi is right, that the meaning we extract from a complex text is ultimately a mirror reflecting our own methodology and our own internal intentions, what does the way you consume your daily information say about you?
Oof, that's a good question.
When you read a news article about a controversial topic, a political post from someone you fundamentally disagree with, or even just a tense email from a coworker, are you reading holistically to understand their true purpose and context?
Or are you just scanning for those blue puzzle pieces?
Exactly. Are you cherry-picking the fragments that confirm exactly what you already chose to believe?